If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People who have encountered cryptids or other tall, otherworldly forest creatures, what did you see out there? So last night, me and my wife were traveling back from the Grand Canyon to Texas and decided to drive through the night. We ended up going through the Gila National Forest between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., I think. We saw lots of wildlife throughout the night, but we expected this and just drove extra cautiously. Well, between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., we came around a turn and were met with what looked like 3 black panthers with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through your soul. It's hard to explain unless you were there to see it. It happened very quickly, but as soon as we pasted them, we both said, "What the duck was that?" It was very strange because even with the bright lights of the car shining directly on them, they still looked as dark as night, and all you could see was the outline of them and those soul-piercing eyes. They did not move an inch and just stared right into our eyes. It was very scary, and we tried to play it off as wolves or something, but after doing some research, I'm not sure what we saw. Any insight would be greatly appreciated. Yesterday, I was sitting on a swing in the woods behind my house, listening to music. I had already been out there for about 20 to 30 minutes. I remember having this awful gut feeling the whole time I was out there, but I really just ignored it. Anyway, while I was on the swing, I kept seeing this big black shadow figure out of the corner of my eye. I saw it about 3 to 4 times, and I just kept telling myself my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I took my headphones out, I started hearing whistling noises. It sounded half like whistling wind, it wasn't at all windy, a dog howling, and a human whistling. And then, in clear sight, I saw this huge black shadow-like figure for maybe a second, then it disappeared. It had the outline of a long, scrawny body with weirdly long arms. I'd say it was about 15 to 20 feet tall. I'm not sure exactly, though. Also, I remember it smelling very strongly of something dead. And not just like a dead bird or something, it reeked. After staying for a few more seconds, I booked it out of there and ran all the way back to my house. Was this a skinwalker? A Wendigo? I'm just confused. I know I'm not going crazy. I'm only 14, and nothing like this has ever happened to me. I recently got into doing some research about skinwalkers and Wendigos because my uncle was telling me about them a few weeks ago. Could anyone tell me what I saw? Okay, so a few years ago, maybe more like 7 years ago, I was at home chilling and talking to my ex. He was my boyfriend at the time, and like 2 other friends. My ex was standing in the doorway. One friend was sitting on the floor by the doorways, and the other was sitting on our TV stand by the foot of the bed. So we were talking, and I jumped like I saw something that startled me, which I did. My ex asked me what's wrong, and I told him I thought I saw something behind him that resembled a weird-looking black wolf that smiled, kind of looked like it was part human, part animal, and he stated that he felt like something pushed him because we both kind of jumped at the same time. Fast forward to 2018, when I was in California. This guy I met out there, who I had no prior connection to before I ended up in SF, has the same wolf-like thing as a mask on his wall, and I was like, OMG, WTF. Needless to say, I never ever went back to there. Does anybody know what that wolf-like thing is or was? I've been trying to gather more information about the wolf-like thing that I saw. About 12 years ago, my friend and I were with 2 other friends in the woods late at night. It was very dark, but moonlit. But, as we were walking out of the woods, with 2 other friends in front and us 2 about 100 feet behind, we both froze. We saw a large, 8-foot-tall, shadow of a bipedal humanoid form. It felt like pure energy, I don't know how else to describe it. It stopped and looked at us, and then just kind of evaporated into nothingness as it walked back into the woods. The weird part is that we both saw it independently and just froze and observed. After it disappeared, we both were like, "Did you just see that?" I didn't feel threatened, and it was just kind of wild. It was also completely silent. We were about 10 to 15 feet from it. Any thoughts? I have only ever told a few people about it. This happened a few months ago, and I've kept it to myself until recently, when I told my dad about it. I was with my brother, who we'll call John for now, and one of our old friends, and we were walking back through a forest back to where we came from. Since I am younger than both of them, they tend to annoy me a lot, but this time they were being really annoying, so I decided to walk ahead. I was about halfway between them and the exit to the forest when I heard things snapping on my left. I just brushed it off and kept walking, but then I started to hear a low mumbling noise, so I stopped and looked around. I asked if anyone was there and got no reply until about 30 to 40 seconds later I heard what sounded like my brother saying, "Come here, I need your help." So I asked what was wrong while keeping my distance because something about his voice sounded wrong, it was distorted. So I waited a few seconds, then he said again, "Come here, I need your help," but in the exact same way as before, so I moved to the side, and that's when I saw it. It was a deer, but it was on its back legs, and its body was rigid and twisted, but the worst part was its eyes, they were exactly the same as mine. I didn't believe that it was a bad creature, it actually seemed quite friendly, but nonetheless, I was scared, so I ran a mile back, and the whole time I could feel it behind me. When I got out of the forest, I fell to my knees and looked back to see it disappear behind some trees. But here's the weird thing, ever since then, I've been having dreams, but not about being chased by them or anything in the dreams I have, so I told my dad about this, and he didn't look surprised or confused at all. He told me of a similar event he had when he was young. If you want to hear about that, let me know. But still, to this day, I remember how I felt and threatened to want it. It was like I was looking at myself, but through a filter. This was the first time I saw it, but I doubt it will be the last. We lived in the Kiamichi Mountains with about a cactus of land at the base of the mountain. It was late at night, and something sprinted in the corner of my eye. My boyfriend quickly ran to the edge of the porch as my dog chased after it. Once I realized what I was seeing, I was begging my dog to come back. It was about 5 feet tall and hunched over with white and black fur. The color of this thing was almost glitchy, it had ears on top of its head and a short snout. We saw no arms at all while it was running, and also a tail, which was a fuzzy tail. It was bipedal and running so fast, but its head wasn't bobbing at all. As my dog ran towards it, she was physically confused, and she stopped and shook her head as she was running in the wrong direction. She's not a dumb dog, she's a cattle dog, and she's never deliberately run in the wrong direction at something she's pursuing. In my shock, all I could mutter was, "Oh my God, is that a human?" It was the only thing I could think of when I saw this dog person running across my yard. The next thing I knew, my boyfriend was walking in the yard to get a better view of it. While I was trying not to pee my pants, this dog thing scaled a cow fence about 5 feet tall behind our RV within absolute seconds. I was halfway inside the house, scared to even be outside, still screeching for my dog to return as she regained her brains and was chasing the thing. My boyfriend said it stood up in the cow field right under the only single light post in the field with its back to him, its shoulders broad, and its height easily adding another 3 feet just standing straight up. Now this all took place within seconds, but it was also clear and slow motion happening. We did investigate the fence the next morning and did find some white coarse hair on the top of the fence, but we ended up losing it shortly after. With no evidence of this, all we have is both of our stories, but they line up immaculately. Living there, I have seen the beast once more on my own, which scared me shitless. A suspected pterodactyl, ghosts, hundreds of UFOs, weird lights in our windows, possible Bigfoots, and a strange woman's voice on the opposite side of a hunting dog pen asking a question in an unknown language with no dogs to bark at her, which is super strange. Has anyone ever seen anything like this? We were living in the northern part of the Mitten, the main part of Michigan, back in the 1980s. One evening, I saw a herd of deer running across the field and into the woods. I had also heard the howl of a wolf. I wasn't too interested, but I knew Dad liked being a wildlife spotter, so I went in and told him that I think the deer were spooked by a wolf pack. Dad got up, grabbed the binoculars off the table by the door, and went out. I sat down and started watching my Friday night shows, thinking nothing of it. Then the door slammed, and I heard Day holler at Mom. It stood up. It ducking stood up, ran to their bedroom, came out loading the shotgun, and stood by the door. Mom told me to go downstairs to the finished basement and watch my TV down there. Dad spent the night in a chair in the living room. The gun was never put back in his gun cabinet. The next day, I asked what was wrong since he was still looking out the front window. He didn't say. He said he didn't want to scare me. Not that it helped because, at the age of 9, I was imagining all sorts of horrors. He passed last year, and I was going through his things with Mom when I saw this folder with werewolf on it. Inside, he had handwritten notes and a few pictures he took. The pictures didn't show anything interesting, but one showed a 6-foot hay roll, and his notes said that it stood taller than the roll. Other pictures showed the churned dirt from a herd of deer running flat out. I'm not totally convinced that he saw something like the dog man, but something scared him. He never used to hunt with friends during deer season, but after that, it was always him and his buddies. My husband and I had a weird experience. We live in New Hampshire on 5 acres of property. I moved here last year. My son and I always walk on the property, on half-cleared, half-wooded trails. The past month, our walks have felt different, just a weird sense I have felt. Cat has also been heightened in behavior, not that it is relevant. Since that feeling, I've started staying closer to the house. Last week, I went out in the afternoon and heard animal noises. Oddly for the time of day, I thought I saw a deer in the woods, but in the past month, all animal sightings, which used to be daily, deer, turkeys, and foxes, had subsided, so I thought, oh, maybe deer are back. I told my husband about it, and we just figured we'd keep an eye. Forward to yesterday, my husband and I put our son down for the night, and while in the room, we heard what sounded like coyotes, but a high-pitched, amplified sound than we had heard before, not a usual noise. I didn't think much until my husband went to lock up for the night. He let out a quick yell of my name. We both looked out the slider door and saw a large figure at the tree line. My husband grabbed a gun and a flashlight, and as soon as that clicked on, it was gone. The only image we saw was probably a 7-tall and lanky figure, upright and all dark, as the moon was under clouds. We basically had our stomachs drop. I'm now not going outside with our son, at least, and I've secured our house. Could it be Wendigo? Mother-in-law jumped to that, apparently she heard folklore growing up. My aunt shared a terrifying story last night when we discussed skinwalkers and similar creatures. She said she was out in the pitch-black forest camping, went out to go piss, then suddenly heard the sound of a dog howling in the distance that felt creepier than usual, then the howl became super demonic/distorted sounding. She said she could hear it in front of her, on the side of her ears, behind her, and above her all at once, echoing like the voice was circling her, and she could feel it in her soul. This is when she realized this was not an animal. She then threw a beer can out in the distance into the darkness, and a second later, the beer can got thrown directly back at her. She was praying a lot and super scared until it suddenly stopped after she yelled out, rebuking it. I'm not sure exactly what she encountered, but the story creeps me out. She felt it to be an evil spirit imitating something to psychologically break her down. They say a lot of bad creepy stuff happens in the forests of Alaska, which is where we live, and she even found another guy who had a very similar experience with seeing a tall, standing upright wolf-like figure in the same camping location. There are more missing people than anywhere else in the world as well. No animals even hang out in the forests at the location she camped, so that shows something, and multiple people have witnessed a paranormal wolf-like creature. I just thought I'd share what she told me. This was about 3 months ago, but I still can't get it off my mind. I live right on the border of Navajo land, and it makes it that much worse. It was about 2 a.m., and I was staying at my friend's house. He had just gotten his motorcycle license, so since we couldn't sleep like dumb kids, we decided to go out riding. We rode out to this little mudding trail in the middle of the forest, where we could ride around and do whatever we wanted. We came to a stop at the end of the trail, and that creepy feeling of being watched started to kick in. I heard light footsteps coming from my right, deeper into the forest. At this point, my friend got off the bike and went to take a pee, leaving me all alone. As I looked out into the forest, I could swear I saw a pair of eyes looking back at me, but they didn't have the glare that came from animal eyes. My friend then shouted out, "Sheesh. This is a big one," sounding like a complete idiot. And then, as I see him walking back to the bike, I hear an exact replica of what my friend said coming back from the direction where I saw the creepy eyes earlier. And no, I'm not joking, it sounded literally exactly the same. At this point, me and my friend both just looked at each other, and then I asked, "Was that you?" He responded with a resounding no. We immediately both got on the bike and rode back home as fast as we could. The entire time, I was trying to shake away all the fear I had because I've heard they feed off of your fears and negative energy. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I don't think I ever will. Last night, at about 2 a.m., my dog started barking viciously. I have a German Shepherd, she's a guard dog. So I'm no stranger to aggressive barks. But this was the most intense behavior I had ever seen before. She was barking at the door, so my first thought was that there's an intruder at the door. Again, I really have never heard her behave like that. I thought about getting a weapon. I was really scared someone might be at the door, but then I remembered that my cat was outside, so maybe it was my cat making a fuss. Even if it was an intruder, my dog would kill someone to protect me. I looked through our peephole, but no one was there. So I opened the door. My dog had been barking the whole time. When I opened the door, instead of going out to sniff around like she usually does, she planted herself in front of me and got even louder. She was guarding me. I have never seen anything like it from her. I looked out to see what it could be, and then I saw it. The first thing I noticed were the eyes. It was like when you shine a light on an animal's eyes, sort of glowing in the nighttime darkness. I then noticed the antlers and thought it must be a deer. But then I realized its face looked about 9 feet above the ground. Then I noticed its body. I could make the outline and could tell it was fur, but it was standing in a human-like position. Hunched over almost on its hind legs. I have never been so terrified. As soon as I realized I was looking at something paranormal, I slammed the door and shut all of my windows, locked all the doors, and hid under the sheets like I was a little kid. I am still shaken up. I can't stop thinking about it. I haven't fallen asleep tonight because every time I close my eyes, I see it. I'm curious what this creature was. I know the appearance of the Wendigo is debated and seems controversial. But I am still terrified by what I saw. If anyone has any information relative to my story, I would love some insight. Thanks to whoever believes me. So when I was about in 7th or 8th grade, me and my mom were driving home from a therapy approach of mine. Note, nothing for being schizoid, just depression and such. It was winter and a full moon, because I remember the snow glowing under the moon. It was only 6 but really dark out because, it was in the middle of winter. So we are going about 55 miles per hour when this thing crosses and stops in front of us. The only way I can describe it is as if you combined a deer, a dog, and a human. It stood about as tall as our windshield, it had the legs of what I can describe as a deer, its back was hunched over, and it was walking on all fours. It had the head of a dog, but its eyes were white, and it didn't have a tail. The freakish thing about this creature was its skin. It wasn't a canine with mange or anything, it had actual human skin all the way down its legs, too long to be dog legs. It smelled like rotting meat, and some parts of the flesh were broken open like if you were scraping your knee. It was pale white, and you could see its veins. And this thing was fast, like it stood there and just ran across the road in the blink of an eye. Me and my mom had to pull over to calm down. We both saw it. This sighting was in southeastern Ohio, between Gallipolis and Athens. I haven't seen the creature since, but it still haunts me to this day, and on that highway, I'm scared to see it again. Can anyone tell me what I saw? So I went over to my friend's house, and he lives close to the national forest. We decided to start a fire and just relax for a bit outside. He had to go see what his sister was doing and walk off. I stayed and watched the fire, and it slowly died to embers in about 5 minutes after he left. It was a blazing fire, and there is no way it should have gone out that fast. So it goes out, I put on music, and then I start to hear almost like joints popping like bubble wrap. I thought nothing of it, but it kept getting closer. I turn around with my flashlight and see this creature with no eyes, ears, or mouth, basically like a rake. I jump up and drop my phone. I quickly run to my free porch and look back, and it just stares at me, and I see his fingers reach around the tree. Fingers are 8 inches or longer. Then it bolted off, and it was so deformed that it ran like a cheetah. Without making noises. I tell my friend, and we go look for his sister, hear noises like voices and animals around us, and keep seeing things. We get them, and they don't believe us. We walk back to the house, and everything seems fine, but after a while, my back feels hit and aches a little. We lift up my shirt, and there are like scratch marks but no blood. It looked almost like whip marks, and me and my friend are nail biters. I didn't feel any pain while we were looking. This is possibly the scariest thing I have experienced. It started when I was staying with a friend one night and we were hanging out like usual. Her father had come in because he thought he saw coyotes and was excited because they don't normally get close to the house. We went out quietly to check it out. He flashed his light towards it, and all we could see were greenish eyes glowing and looking towards us near the tree line. That's all we could see. Since we thought it was a coyote her father had shot at, we didn't know if he had hit it or not, but the eyes were still there. But after he had shot at it, it started moving its head in an unnatural way, kind of nodding side to side. We went to check it out to see if it was injured, and we were lying out there when we looked all around the area and saw nothing. We even drove around the woods to see if it had tried running away. That wasn't the last time I saw this creature. About a month or so later, my friend had gotten sent away for a while. I've always been a close family friend, so I decided to come up with her father to stay for a couple days and check up on him. It was kind of early in the morning and a sunny day. Her father had told me he was going to work and I would be in the house alone until he got back in the afternoon. So he left, and I was hanging out in the living room, playing on my phone. I left the door open since it was nice out. All of a sudden, I felt the need to look out the window because I thought someone was outside. I opened the curtains and looked around, then saw something about the corner of my eye in the area. We saw the coyote. A while back, I looked in that direction and saw this terrifying human-like creature around the same spot on the border of the trees. It was sort of kneeled down like a person looking directly at me. It was all black and very skinny, had longish legs and arms, was a bit tall, and had this wood and leaf-looking cape thing on its back. It also did not seem to have any facial features from what I could see, Just the facial structure and indents where the eyes should be. I was in shock, staring at it. It's like I couldn't take my eyes off of this creature, trying to make sure I was actually seeing this shit and not my mind playing tricks on me, so I kept looking at it, and all of a sudden it raised its hand up and it seemed like it was waving at me, and it tilted its head to the side and started nodding its head just like what we thought the coyote did. After that, I snapped back and stood up to run and close the door. When I got to the door, someone was driving up to the house, and the creature was no longer there. I then got the duck out of there. Here is something else that happened before both experiences that may or may not be related to this creature. One other night while my friend and I were home alone, we were just chilling on our phones, and my friend kept falling asleep, and I was getting creeped out, so I kept waking her up, and then she started talking nonsense that her father was here and talking to her, and I could snap her out of it, and she would ask where he was, which she knew he left but was convinced he came back home. I sort of laughed about it and explained to her that he hadn't come back home yet. She seemed really tired but kept talking about him being there, which I disagreed with. Then all of a sudden we heard her father's voice from the hallway or other room say her name, just like he would if he were there trying to get her attention or for her to come in there. We both heard it loud and clear, but no one was home but us, not even anyone outside. After that, we didn't hear anything else for a while. After a little bit, we still had our guards up because of what happened, and we started hearing noises from outside, which sounded like multiple people talking and laughing, kind of like her father and his friends. We were very scared by then and called her father to see when he would be home and to hurry up, and he said he was on his way home. The voices calmed down, and her father got home. If anyone knows what this creature could be, please let me know. It would be very appreciated. This is a story I heard a few years ago from my flatmate at the time. Happened in Hungary. His dad was a hunter, so he took him hunting quite a lot, and if memory serves me right, Dad was employed by something like the National Guard, so not someone who's easily scared. Anyway, this one night they are out, flatmate around 10 at the time, and camped in the meadow near the forest, early autumn, so not too cold. At some point, while having dinner, they heard rustling in the nearby woods. It is not surprising that there is a lot of wildlife around. I can't recall the in-between, but eventually they went to investigate. They spotted a wild boar, and Dad was about to take a shot when something large rose up on their right. It was dark, so they could not see much, but they were also too close to the thing, around 300 meters max. The grass was not too tall, so it appeared that it was either crouching without moving or lying, but once it rose, it was clearly walking on 2 feet, but it wasn't a human. Dark fur, clearly canine features, and glowing eyes. It looked them over and just walked away. They were frozen in place, and my flatmate said he had never been so scared in his life. They took off running, jumped into the car, and drove away. His dad had another sighting of something similar while on patrol, but I don't remember that story well, and unfortunately, I haven't bumped into the guy since. The story fascinated me, but I also remember that while telling it, he was scared and guarded. This is not much at all, but I hope someone finds this interesting. The incident happened in late summer 2018. It was in the mountains of North Georgia. I'm a surveyor with 20 years of experience in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North and South Carolina. So, I'm extremely comfortable in the woods, as I spend so much time outdoors, most of that time being very far back in the forest. And a great deal of it is on national forest land, where you don't see anyone for days at a time. On the day it happened, I was surveying a piece of property around a small Corps of Engineers lake bordering a large tract of national forest land. I was operating a robotic survey total station, transit, which means you don't need a partner to run a survey crew, and instead of having 2 or 3 people on a crew, you generally work alone. The property was fairly large, approximately 500 acres, made up of mostly steep mountains and hollows covered in dense mountain laurel. I had just finished cutting a traverse line along the property line running to the top of the ridge roughly 350 to 400 away with my machete. Traverse lines are typically about 5 wide and cut as close to the ground as possible to ensure a line of sight for the instrument. I just walked back down the slope to get ready to traverse to the top of the ridge when I noticed someone or something hairy wearing what I originally thought was a hat slowly walk across the opening that I just made a few minutes earlier and stopped to look at me. It had a large hand reaching up to grab the tree limb it was next to. At the time, I thought someone must have been walking or hiking the top of the ridge, as it's not uncommon to see people from time to time. But then I realized it was way too hot to be wearing a large, shaggy brown jacket, as it was in the high 90s. And as it stared downhill at me, I could make out pointed ears on top of its head and a long snout. Then it slowly walked out of sight. At this point, I took out my headphones and started paying closer attention to the situation. As I took out my headphones, I realized it was dead silent in the woods, and in Georgia during the summertime, it's always extremely loud with insects. I waited a few minutes and walked to the top of the ridge to grab my equipment, that I seriously considered leaving, and see what was going on. I noticed disturbed vegetation leading in the direction I saw it walking. Thinking harder about what was happening, I realized that the lower limb on the tree I saw it walk behind as it went out of sight was right at 6 tall. And what I originally thought to be a jacket was fur. That's when it all set in, and I got scared. I could hear something moving in the short distance coming from the area it walked to. So, I decided to start making the 45 to 50-minute walk to the truck. I could hear movement up on the ridge parallel to me and above me during my walk back. But I didn't think it was moving in reaction to me necessarily. Although I wasn't willing to wait around and find out, I made it to the truck, and since then, I've only told 2 people about my experience. That was pretty much it, as far as the encounter goes. I know it wasn't a bear, as I've been around them my whole life and see them all the time. I've definitely been deep in the woods. On several occasions, I experienced all sounds and signs of life just disappearing at the drop of a hat. It takes on new significance now. I carry a pistol every day and, on some occasions, a short rifle if the job calls for it due to bears, wild dogs, finding illegal pot growing operations, etc., but I can definitely say it brought me zero comfort on that day. I was scared to my very core. And I have a new sense of respect for the woods now. I would advise that if you work alone in the woods, please pay attention to your surroundings. I think a lot about what might have happened if I hadn't looked up when I did. Or if I'd been a little slower walking back down the hill. I was probably very close to it with my back turned before walking downhill with my headphones while listening to Joe Rogan. If it wanted me, I wouldn't be here today. I firmly believe I was within mere yards of it up on the ridge, with no idea I was being shadowed by a monster. People go missing all the time in the woods and are never seen again. I believe I know what takes some of them, as I've seen it. Whether you believe me or not is of no consequence to me. But it took me a long time to feel comfortable telling anyone about my experience. If it helps one person pay attention in the woods, I'm happy to be called crazy over it. Stay safe, and please watch your kids in the woods above anyone else. God bless. I believe that I saw a cryptid that most people would know as a dogman or a wolfman of the sort in the NJ Pine Barrens. A little bit about me first. When I received my license at 17 years old, I started spending all my free time outdoors, hiking all over the East Coast, but mostly within the NJ Pine Barrens since I live in NJ. I just graduated from Stockton University with a bachelor's degree in environmental science, and I worked as a naturalist at Batstow Village in Wharton State Forest for a while, which is the biggest state forest within the NJ Pine Barrens. I got the job before my internship ended due to my knowledge of plants and animals. They did not expect me to have the credentials because, at the time, I was not even finished with my first semester in college. I only give out this information because when I see an animal in the woods, day or night, I know with 100% certainty what I'm looking at. And after almost 6 years from the time of writing this story, I can't wrap my head around the creature that I saw. I am an open-minded person to a point. I do believe certain cryptids can exist solely if the biology of the creature is possible, but that does not put a bipedal canine on my list. Roughly about 6 years ago, I, along with 2 of my friends, one a welder and one a mechanic, and I will be naming the welder Chris and the mechanic Alan, went off-roading in my friend Alan's truck somewhere in Manchester, New Jersey. We met with a bunch of Alan's off-roading buddies in a spot they frequented. I do not know the specific area, only that it was in Manchester, New Jersey, and it was very close to the general vicinity of the abandoned brick factory, and hung out for a few hours, drove around the dirt trails, and just had a good time socializing with other people. I did not have any alcohol or any pot in my system because after we left I had to drive myself home, so I was sober along with my Alan, who was also sober, but my friend Chris was a bit high. We were beginning to leave, and as we were taking the trails to get back to the main road, my friend Alan told me to help look out for deer. He was driving about 35 miles per hour because the dirt path we were on was pretty open, about 30-ish feet wide, and we were dead in the middle in case he did have to respond to a deer jumping out of the tree line. A few minutes go by, and my sharp eyes spot a deer running along the side of the truck, but within the tree line, so the view of it wasn't more than a dark brown patch of fur. As I'm about to say something to my friend Alan, thinking that this deer is going to run in front of the car and try to commit suicide, it speeds up its pace significantly, gets about 20 feet ahead of the truck still in the tree line, and then proceeds to jump out in front of the truck. For as long as I live, I will never forget what I saw that night. It ran onto its 2 back legs, looked right up at us, and to our horror, it ran by this about 30-foot wide dirt road in 2 to 3 steps and went into the opposite tree line. In those few seconds, I saw this dog man or wolf man, and to this day, I cannot forget what I saw. It was roughly 7 feet tall, estimating its height using my friend Alan's lifted truck as a reference, covered in dark brown fur. Every inch of its body I saw was covered in this dark brown fur, but the chest/stomach area had less fur and a lighter colored fur than the rest of the body. But even under all this fur, you could make out extreme muscle definition, very similar to an Olympic bodybuilder. It also had a canine type head with a long snout, 2 distinct perked up wolf ears, and large muscular legs. The torso and arms were similar to those of a very muscular man with large hands. The hands had visible claws that looked like they could do some real damage, and its eyes reflected an unnatural color of light that I haven't seen in the animal kingdom. As soon as it jumped into the opposing tree line, my friend Alan slammed on the brakes, and my friend Chris said, "I know I'm high, but what the actual duck was that?" My friends, puzzled by what we just saw, look at me and go, "Okay, nature, boy, please tell us that was something explainable." I sat there dumbfounded and told them I did not have an answer based on reason, science, or anything else I could logically think of, and my friend Alan hightailed it out of there. To this day, my friend Chris has convinced himself that it wasn't a hallucination because of the pot, and my other friend Alan, who does not believe in the supernatural and absolutely refuses to have an open mind, does not speak about this event and pretends it didn't happen. To this day, I still have no logical explanation for what I saw. I do not believe that a bipedal canine creature could logically or biologically exist, but what I saw was something matching that description with my own eyes, and it is very real. So this happened to my friend, not me, back in 2007. So here goes. She was walking home from her friend's house at night. This is a town in southern Oregon. She doesn't remember the exact time but says it was definitely after midnight. It was dark, and no one else was out. So she's on her way home and just about 2 blocks from her house. She was walking on the sidewalk along the main street and was crossing between 5th and 6th streets. Her house is on 7th. Across the street is a Safeway and a cemetery. Right then, she noticed something about 50 feet ahead of her, crossing the street from the cemetery side to the side she was on. This is how she describes it. There were 2 creatures walking on their hind legs, side by side. One was slightly shorter than the other, but they were both really tall, at least 7 feet. They were hunched over, lanky, and extremely skinny. She says her immediate first thought was that they looked almost like deer walking on their hind legs, but they didn't have any fur. It was more like a dark grayish skin. They held their arms and wrists kind of like how a T-Rex would, but their arms and hands were very long, almost as long as their legs. When I asked, she said she didn't see any tails. I asked her if they had hooves, and she says she thinks so but can't remember that part for certain. Everything was quiet, and she didn't hear them making any sounds on the pavement as they walked. I asked her if they had antlers or deer-like shaped faces. She said there were no antlers, and their heads were not shaped like deer or any animal but more like people. She describes their faces as looking human, with human features, but something was just slightly off. She had frozen where she was as soon as she saw them. Everything was quiet, and there were no cars driving by or anyone else around, which is normal at night in our small town. She says she stood there, kind of in shock. She watched as the 2 creatures slowly walked side by side, silently, from across the street and over to the side of the street she was on. She says they didn't seem to see her at all, or if they did notice her, they didn't act at all like they did. She says they acted as if they were simply a couple going on a casual night stroll together. She doesn't remember feeling any negative energy or vibes, she just felt fear because she was pretty damn scared. As soon as they finished crossing the street, they continued to straight down 6th Street, and she couldn't see them after they passed the first house and kept walking down. At that point, she said she snapped out of the shock and started running 1 more block towards 6th Street to see where they were going. Once there, she turned down 6th Street to follow them, but they were completely gone. She doesn't know where they could have possibly gone that fast considering they're just walking, and not walking fast, but, like I said, almost as if the 2 of them were just out on a casual night stroll. As soon as she realized they had somehow disappeared out of nowhere, she started running as fast as she could the 1 more block to her house on 7th Street. She told her mom and sister the next morning. She says these creatures were like nothing she has ever seen or heard of before. She only ever told her family and a few friends, me being one of them. Oh, and she also has no history of any mental illnesses. But whenever I ask her about it, she describes it the exact same way and is still pretty shaken up when she thinks about it. Nothing like that has happened to her before then or since then. Anyone know what this could be? I've heard about note deers, but I'm not sure that really fits because I think those are more animal-like shaped and usually on all 4s. Dog man sighting. I was staying in the Catskill Mountains in New York State for a few days. I had booked an Airbnb with my girlfriend where we could bring our dog, a 100-pound German Shepherd. The Airbnb was a strange RV that was converted or expanded into a cabin. The place was far away from any other houses, and on the side road, basically on the side of a mountain, there was an amazing view. The stay had 2 fire pits, one was right next to the cabin, and the other was about 800 feet away on top of a hill. The last night we were there, we were having one last fire in the faraway fire pit. The fire pit had a great view of the mountain range and cornfields on one side, and the other side sat up against the woodline. We had our dog off leash, he is very well mannered, and we were playing some music on a Bluetooth speaker. Our dog kept looking towards the woodline, and it was freaking my girlfriend out. We would occasionally turn the music off and just listen to see if we could hear anything. I also had a small LED flashlight and would scan the woods with it, looking for any animal eyes it picked up. Well, after a little bit of this, my dog jumped up to his feet and started, full force, aggressively growling at the woods, very out of character for him. Just as I was getting up and turning the music off, my dog darted into the woods, maintaining his high alert status. He juked left, and I heard something take only a few steps back in response. I was able to call him back to me right away, at which point he crept back, keeping his eyes locked on this creature. As my girlfriend held our dog's collar, I stepped closer into the woods with my flashlight and small knife in hand. As I was scanning the woods, my flashlight picked up on a set of eyes, which now looked and sounded a lot further back than we had heard the steps. The eyes were glowing like a dog's eyes in the light of my LED flashlight, but the height was what threw me off. It was too tall to be any animal. I would expect to see a raccoon, coyote, skunk, etc., so I figured it was a black bear. Although black bears are very skittish with people, especially dogs, unless protecting their young, it wasn't adding up in my head. I sat there for a solid 3 to 4 minutes, trying to focus on what this was. The eyes also didn't look like a bear, they looked like a crouching dog. I was lost in my curiosity, and my girlfriend went into almost shock, put the music back on, and said, "Were you getting out of here and going inside?" I kept telling her to turn the music off and started walking back to her without turning from the woods, but I wasn't going to stay out there alone. She started dragging our dog back to the cabin, and my dog and I had our eyes fixed on the woods. As soon as my flashlight went off, the creature started following along with us in the woods. The footsteps I heard sounded just like a person walking in the woods, and as it followed us, I heard at least 2 separate sets walking near it in the woods. We got inside the cabin, locked the door, shut all the blinds, and were completely freaked out. I spent the next hour or so listening and watching out the window, hoping the animal would walk into the spotlight off the cabin so I could identify it. I never saw anything step out, but the footsteps continued walking around back there, behind the cabin in the woods. I stepped out the door about an hour or 2 later but heard nothing and searched with my flashlight. Whatever I heard that night was not afraid of my dog, and I have never seen my dog act like this. My dog will chase rabbits and even deer without making a sound. Luckily, he always comes back to me when I call him. I have spent a lot of time outdoors in my life and have always been able to identify any animal encounters. I have asked a lot of my hunting friends about this and asked if any animal would react like this and not instantly run away from a dog of his size. The mystery of not knowing is what creeps me out the most. I had never heard of a dog man at the time, so it didn't even cross my mind during the sighting until I started researching crouching dog sightings online. My girlfriend hates to talk about whatever I saw and heard that night, so here I am presenting my story as a hopeful skeptic. This happened when I was 14. For a little background, this takes place at my grandparents' house. They live in Virginia, so I'm aware that it probably isn't a skinwalker, but the description in the sub says other cryptids, and I'm just wondering what this was, in a forest by a large river in a loose community. There are about 3 roads in the community, one of which has about 15 houses, a short road that leads to some wetlands that smell terrible, and then there is a long road that leads down to the river and has 3 large houses. That's the road my grandma lives on. Her house is by the water, but on the other side of the house, across the gravel road, is her garage. This garage is about 100 to 200 feet back from the road and looks more like a large house than a garage. It is nestled against the tree line of the forest. When this happened, I was with my siblings and my cousins. So it was dark out, and someone had the amazing idea of playing manhunt. The boundaries were set on the land that the grandparents owned, which included the garage. One of my cousins and I decided it would be best to stick together so we could split up if someone found us. We crawled into some bushes by the road and waited. Not long after we settled down, I started to get a feeling. It was very soft at first, just a tugging sensation in the back of my mind that something was off. I slowly started to pay more and more attention to the noises around me. Everything sounded normal. By normal, I mean the cicadas were buzzing so loudly I could hardly hear anything else. Still, there was the feeling that I needed to move. At this point, I suggested we were too close to the road and maybe we should change spots. We crawled out of the bushes and moved across the gravel road, making a wide arc around the garage to prevent the motion lights from going off and showing my sister, who was hunting us, where we were. When I stepped out onto the field and saw that the garage was on the other side, I was aware of something. I couldn't tell what, but I had something's attention. It wasn't the feeling of being watched but more like knowing that something was out there, and it knew I was here but didn't know where I was exactly yet. I downplayed it and thought it might have been my brother, as he likes to sneak up on people. Besides, me and my cousin often get the feeling that things are watching us, and if I brought it up, she would only freak out. So my cousin and I head for the tree line next to the garage. Now the ground behind the tree line slopes down suddenly, at what I would say is a steep angle, for about 3 feet before flattening out. Kind of like if you Google forest roads and look at how, just off the sides, the ground slopes down suddenly. We laid on our stomachs and watched the road from our new hiding spot just inside the forest. I noticed after a minute that things were quieter. I looked back for a second and was just kind of listening to my gut for a minute. How could I not? It was practically screaming at me to get up and run. I knew that something was definitely watching me. I decided just to lay perfectly still and observe my surroundings. It was dark, and I could only see the barn in the field. I had no chance of seeing anything in the forest due to the leaves blocking most of the moonlight. It seemed very quiet and very wrong. I noticed the cicadas had stopped buzzing. I couldn't even hear the crickets. It got so quiet that I heard ringing in my ears, and the only noise I could hear was the light crunching of leaves under my cousin's stomach as she breathed. By this point, she was looking around, clearly frightened. When I slowly looked up at her, I could tell she had the same feeling of dread, the feeling that something was waiting and it was about to do something. When she opened her mouth to say something, we both heard a sudden cracking noise behind us, and both of us decided we didn't want to die. I've never run faster in my life. The motion lights from the garage turned on, and I could see the shadow of something behind us. We ran to where our grandparents' driveway started, as it was much brighter. I looked back to see if my cousin was behind me, and I almost tripped over my own feet. I could only see its silhouette. It was, at my guess, 7 or maybe 8 feet tall. Its arms were too long, and its chest was thicker than it should be. Its head was human but also not human. The shape of it was wrong. It had 2 yellow eyes that locked onto my frozen figure. It turned its head slightly and watched me while I stared at it. My cousin was not going to let me stand there and die, so she started pulling me back to the house and screaming at me. The thing across the street then turned its head to the side as if it were watching for a car to come down the gravel road. It looked like its face had skin but not the area around its lips or teeth. Think of anywhere that you could bite your own cheek or lips, the skin and flesh around there were gone. Its teeth were something else. One of the things that was wrong with it was that its face was simply too big. Its teeth were huge, and they stuck out a bit from its face. I got the feeling it was showing me this to taunt me. As if to say, "Want to stick around and find out more?" No, I did not, and after figuring out the whole big, sharp teeth thing, I was happy to run to the porch and hide with my cousin. We hid there for a half hour. We only came out after someone suggested that maybe we hid across the street, and I was not okay with one of my family members possibly running into that thing again. While my cousin and I were hiding, we talked about how no one would believe us and how if someone did believe us, then it would be our grandmother, who would probably then try and find it. Both of us agreed not to tell our family. When it's dark at my grandma's house, my cousin no longer goes outside and stays in the house. I don't stray far from the light of the house, and I don't go near any bushes. When I'm inside, I make sure all the windows are shut and locked. If I'm feeling brave, I'll sit at the end of the pier with my feet in the water, looking back at the house. Never with my back to the shore. While I'm outside and sometimes when I stand near windows with the curtains and shades open, I get the feeling it's watching me in the dark, wherever it lurks. I'm curious as to what this was. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a skinwalker because Virginia isn't exactly close to any Navajo reservations. Me, 16 meters, along with a few friends, I'll call them Jim, 22, Jack, 22, and Jake, 21, decided to go skinwalker hunting, walk around the woods like a group of fools, last night. We split up into teams of 2, me and Jake, and Jim and Jack. Jim and Jack stayed in the woods, and me and Jake walked down the creek a little bit. After standing there for around 15 minutes, Jim and Jack started heading our way, and Jim said he heard something. Jim led us to where he and Jack were sitting and claimed he heard something behind him and that he turned and caught a glimpse of it. We decided to walk closer to the house but decided to sit and go lights out by a wood splitter my dad has in the woods. After maybe 5 minutes of sitting there, Jim stands up and starts repeating no and claiming he heard something walking next to us. We walked out of the woods and stood by the garage, about 40 to 50 yards away from the woods. Jim was watching the tree line and claimed to see something crouching, but lost it after a while. He ordered us inside the garage and started talking about whether he didn't know if it was a skinwalker or a Wendigo. Now, it's probably important that we are not in Crawford County, Ohio, or near either tribe, as the legend of the skinwalker or Wendigo would be. I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. I'm the kind of person who won't believe it until I see it, so that's why we were out. I want to hear your opinion on what it might have been or if there was even anything there in the first place. Also, the thing was described as light gray and 7 to 9 feet tall. Also, what Jim and Jake describe a skinwalker as is not even close to the actual lore behind it. Ever since I was a baby, I was a magnet for the paranormal, ghosts, demons, and whatever was in the middle. I would always feel something watching me 24/7. I don't know when it started, but sometime around being 6 years old. I had 2 dogs at the time and would, of course, let them out whenever I was home from school and during the night. It was all normal until I started seeing this thing in the back corner of my backyard every single night. It was pretty large and looked like my dog, but it would just stand there and stare at me with glowing red eyes. It had the form of a large dog, almost coyote-like. And every night when I took my dogs out, they would be there, watching me. It filled me with so much terror and dread whenever I saw it. I would be frozen in fear. It was so bad that I wouldn't take my dogs outside alone anymore. I tried showing my dad and pointing at it, yet on his end, he saw nothing. Neither I nor my mom believed me, which drove me crazy. It terrified my younger self due to the eerie resemblance of it to my, at the time, current dog. I could see its facial expressions, its body, and the angle at which it would move. Sometimes the thing would even pace around in the corner of my yard. But it never left that spot. And I only ever saw it at night. During the day, it would disappear. It would stare at me even through the windows and blinds, as if it knew exactly where and when I was going to see it. This all repeated for years, might I add. All the way until intermediate school, 5th grade. I should also add that my dogs never seemed to react to it. Now that I am older, I have barely seen it, but I wanted to ask if anyone had an idea of what this was. This dog-like thing terrorized me throughout my childhood, and I really want to know what it was. I was spending a month with my cousins at my grandma's house. She lives in a rural area of Michigan, which means either thick forest, deserted highway, or flat farmland, her house being in the last. It was August, and my cousins' ages ranged from 10 to 15, and I was the oldest, being 15. I was staying with a 10, 13, and 14-year-old. This wasn't the first time we were staying at our grandma's house for a long period of time, because my mom's family went back to Italy every summer and never brought the kids, so we stayed with our dad's mom, because my dad went, too. We stayed up telling scary stories often, but one night, a few weeks in, we decided to make a campfire out back at the fire pit. My grandma's house is on the more suburban side of the rural area. The neighbors aren't too far, a 3-minute walk house to house, when you're driving down the road to her house, but in the backyard, it's a thick forest with man-made paths through it, and each backyard is several hundred acres. And her road is on a hill, so only part of the basement was actually underground. That isn't important until later, though. So, we're towards the east side of her yard, in a smallish patch of open land. You couldn't see the neighboring yards from there, and there were probably 3/4 of a mile to each side of us that belonged to my grandma. It was maybe 11 at night, and we were playing truth or dare after telling scary stories, and my 14-year-old cousin dared me and the 13-year-old to go walk through the paths for 10 minutes or so because it was dark and the forest was creepy. I said yes right away, as I wasn't easily scared and was rather level-headed, but my younger cousin was a bit more hesitant, but eventually he agreed. We didn't bring a flashlight because it wasn't pitch dark yet, and we could see enough to not die. We were walking through the paths, talking and laughing, for about 5 minutes and could barely see the fire through the trees when we decided to turn. In the middle of the path was a large dog-like creature, hunched over with its front hands an inch from the ground. What I remember most was how its eyes were so ducking bright white, and it was humanoid dog shaped with a human-like head but a dog-like body but human hands and feet. It looked right at us, and I know I was paralyzed with fear as it dashed away the opposite way from us, towards a creek that ran through the yard. My cousin and I screamed bloody murder, and the other cousins and my grandma ran to us. I don't remember much here because I was really disoriented and couldn't think properly, but I did wake up in bed, so I assumed that I was brought up to the house. All the kids slept in the basement, in a big room with sliding glass doors to the outside, as the room was on the side of the basement that wasn't underground. My bed was pressed against a big glass window, and I could see my cousins playing outside down below. The house is in Michigan, so it gets slightly chilly even at the end of August, and there was a slight breeze, so I put on a jacket and ran to join them outside, skipping breakfast, not wanting to miss out on anything fun. When I got down, I could tell they weren't playing but rather running to get my grandma. Her dogs, both of them, were dead and ripped up. That night, we went to bed early. I woke up at maybe 2 in the morning because I felt something hit my head. My cousins were all sitting on the double bed opposite me on the other side of the room. There was one bunk bed and 2 double beds, the double beds for me and my 14-year-old cousin. They were being quiet and staring at me. The 13-year-old nodded his head toward the window. I froze. They all looked afraid. I turned my head slightly to the side, and I saw a really messed up looking face pressed to the window with gaping eyes looking down at me. I screamed so ducking loud, and it bolted. The police came the next day after getting 2 calls from my grandma, one about a stalker and the other about the dogs. We told them everything we could, but we couldn't find anything. We stayed at my house for the rest of the summer, with my grandma and cousins. Since then, I've been allowed to stay with friends, and I rarely stay at my grandma's anymore. In July of 2014, I had been dating my now ex-boyfriend for only a couple months when I decided to move in with him. I'm going to change names for the sake of anonymity. Let's call him Tom. So Tom lives on the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation in western New York. He's 100% Seneca and his family property's on res land. I'm only 25% Seneca, and because my mom is white, I'm not an enrolled member. So I never grew up going to a longhouse or living on the res because the majority of my family are white Catholics. He lives on a side road of the major road going through the res called Route 438. One night we got into a super big argument, and I was pissed and wanted to get away for a bit. Living with him full time didn't offer me a break when I needed it, and I didn't have a car. So I decided that at 2 a.m. I would say duck it and walk out. Anger clouded my judgment, and I just had to leave. He kept trying to get me to stay, blocked the door, picked me up, and brought me back in, but I was adamant. His concern was that I'd run into drunk weirdos cruising around as I walked into town. I was so angry that I didn't give a shit, and I also had grown up walking the woods at night and had never had an issue. So I walk out the door, up the driveway, and start heading down his road. Pitch black with a brush on both sides, but there's a few trailers his aunts and uncles owned. As I get closer to the stop sign where his road ends and connects to Route 438, I see a light heading towards me. I got freaked out and realized it was a person heading towards me. It is not uncommon for people to be walking the res at night, but as we got closer, I debated turning back. But I was so mad at my ex that I told myself I had to keep going. Suddenly, the person goes, ILYSB 1977? What the hell? And I recognized the voice as Tom's cousin that lives in the trailer behind us. I was so relieved that it was him and not a stranger. We stopped to talk, and he told me he was walking home from a party. I told him that I and Tom fought and that I was heading into town to stay with friends. He told me I was crazy and that it's not safe for girls to walk around at night, and he told me I could stay at his trailer for the night. It sounds more logical than walking almost 9 miles alone. We head back towards the end of the road where the trailers are, and we pass a clearing in the brush where the old driveway was. I look into the clearing, and I can't really explain what I saw. It was so dark, but I could see that whatever this was much darker. It was a completely black, skinny, but massive human-like shape. It was crouched so its knees were in front of its stomach. But the arms were so long. I'm shaking writing this, and I can't explain what it looked like, but I can see it in my mind. I saw it quickly and then looked straight ahead. 3 seconds later, I turned to Tom's cousin and said, "Did you see that?" He said yes, and we instantly just took off, sprinting as fast as possible. He was faster, and I started yelling for him to not leave me behind. We got into his trailer and sat in silence. I think maybe we both saw it and didn't know for sure until we said something to each other. The walk felt fine until we came up on that clearing. Even before I saw it, I felt an ominous feeling and the sense of being watched. The arms were so long that even when crouched or seated with its knees bent, it was able to keep its back upright. Not bend its back to make its hands reach the ground. It seems to be 7 or more feet tall. I have no idea what it could be, and I have not experienced anything of the sort since that night. My ex would never want to talk about it and told me I was just seeing shit. But his cousin saw it too. The way he took off was just pure terror. I was part of a land management team that kept finding panther tracks in a remote area of Florida. Not completely impossible, because it was not far from known Florida panther range, but then we had some visual sightings, cubs, and year-round tracks, which prompted numerous denials on the part of state and fed wildlife agencies. Then we got trail cam photos, and they classified the animal as a non-viable hybrid. Ultimately, we got multiple casts and good photos, and it was finally established that yes, a reproducing Florida panther had set up temporary residence in that area. It's not a huge deal except that it opened my eyes to how insistent and purposefully ignorant government wildlife officials can be when confronted with information about protected species that doesn't exactly fit into their hard-won, heavily political recovery plans and critical habitat. The long-term implications of having the area where we discovered a reproducing Florida panther reclassified as critical habitat, which never happened, BTW, would have included land development restrictions to the tune of potentially billions lost by a land development group that included the governor, at the time. My coworker who deployed the cameras was nearly fired because she had done it without proper authorization, although we use trail cams all the time for all sort of reasons without asking. It was pretty disgusting, overall. My second favorite involves a nighttime sighting of an unknown bipedal, hairy ape-looking thing. I don't call it Bigfoot because, well, that carries a lot of unwanted or undefined implications, when a scientist says it. But if there are actual Bigfoot, it was probably one of them. I was driving along a gravel backroad in WV, prior to the construction of I-77 in the southern half of the state. This particular road eventually dead ends for all practical traffic purposes, but it actually just terminated, at the time. Now there are a few houses and fences, at an old log landing site, from which various trails diverge to the south and west, generally downhill from the large plateau that Beckley sits on. At the time, the nearest houses were about 9 miles to the east, where this road connects with US 19, or about 6 miles as the crow flies. To the west, there were about 20 miles of mostly uninterrupted forest with only a few very rough 4WD drive trails in between. It was just after dusk, and snowing. I was heading east from the dead-end area during a brief visit to the general area, where I had been scouting for a potential place to do some black powder rifle hunting, that is a limited, late winter season for hunting whitetail deer with primitive rifles, a nice excuse to spend time alone in the woods when it is blue cold and few others venture out. So as I rounded a small bend in the road, my headlights swept across the road and illuminated this thing just casually strolling across. I was already creeping slowly because of the snow cover. The entire encounter lasted maybe 6 or 7 seconds. It slowed in the middle of the gravel road, looked towards my car, which was about 50 or 60 feet away, and then slowly strolled on into the dark woods. It was so unexpected that I drove on, trying to figure a way to explain it to myself, try to remember some visual or detail that would confirm an ID as a bear or human or something that made sense. About a half-mile down the road, it dawned on me that I had seen one of the strangest things I would ever see, and I turned around and went back to the area. This was during the early days of flip phones, and I had no flashlight or cell coverage there. I stopped with my lights shining into the same section of road for a while, to see if anything showed itself. Then I got out with my flip phone and searched for tracks. I saw general track shapes, but it was too dark to see any detail or get a photo. I left, and it snowed all night, and when I went back the next morning there was absolutely no sign. I've been back to the same place dozens of times since then. Haven't seen it or anything like it since. It really bugs me. I have recently been exploring sites and videos based on the strange and terrifying stories other people have shared, and I feel this is the only place I feel safe discussing them. I'm from a small town in southwest Arkansas called Fouke, famous for the Boggy Creek Monster. The monster is a Sasquatch who, in the 1970s, allegedly terrorized my hometown and the surrounding area, which spawned the documentary The Legend of Boggy Creek. I have sadly never seen this large ape-like wonder but have seen first-hand evidence of it and far worse monsters out in the swamps and hills my family and I have hunted our entire lives. There are 1,000 stories I could tell here, but the one that bothers me the most is the reason I no longer feel safe in the backwoods of my own homeland. It began one evening when I was 15. Where we live, despite what wildlife officials of any form will admit, there are numerous large and deadly animals. A razorback boar can gore a man's leg deep enough to cripple them or kill them if it gets you on the ground. Gators can grow to just about any length, and the only thing they fear is a bigger gator, and then there are the panthers. We have heard and witnessed panthers kill and haul a calf weighing well over double their size straight up a tree and gnawing at it for days. They scream like a terrified woman and can move silently through a brush or outright overtake almost anything. Quite frankly, they unnerve me, but what I found on my own deer lease close to a decade ago has shook me ever since. I never walked those woods unarmed, and I never shall. I'm a big guy at 200 pounds or more and an easy 6'2", and while hunting, I always carried a Winchester 7mm, a Taurus Judge revolver loaded with buckshot or homemade rounds, and kukri for brush or emergencies. Nothing, I believed, could stand back up from a straight round from my rifle, but whatever the hell this was, I didn't even notice it. I followed what I thought to be a hog trail up a hill near a distant stand we used during the second day of the deer season. I had never seen such an easy game trail in my life, and to be honest, I was relieved as I only had about an hour of daylight left. Then I found the blood, not much, but enough to know something had hurt it. I could physically see the signs of the poor thing being goated, along with bits of tissue and sizable amounts of blood coating the ground every few feet. I hit the crest of a hill, and at the bottom, I found what I thought was going to be it. A leg and a mangled and bloody stump lie there alone. It died right there, as I deduced from the blood around, as it was far more than I thought any hog could even have. Worse still, the kill was fresh, with steam coming off the severed end of the remains. The hog's tracks and blood showed less than 2 hours, and it had to be more than 100 pounds. I fired my rifle in the air twice to signal for help, then I searched the area. Whatever it was, the poor animal did not put up a fight, and the thing that killed it didn't leave a single track. I found a small blood trail leading off from the area and left something personal there to clue the others. By this point, I had half an hour of daylight, so I used my kukri to mark a tree every few feet as I walked. Within 10 minutes, I found the rest of the boar, though it wasn't alone. Dozens of bodies were there, ranging from deer, pigs, cattle, dogs, and a panther. The cat's decapitated head sat in the center as all the gore and carcasses lay strewn around it like a sick display. Remembering it as I am now, I make the joke that it was a garden. A crimson, fetid garden is made in the deepest parts of the woods, where no man should be foolish enough to wander. Suddenly, I heard a noise and snapped out of my horror-stricken state. I chambered around and caught a glimpse of it. It had thin, pale grayish-white skin, its eyes were black, and it had long claws that were still dripping with the hog's entrails. It tucked behind a tree and appeared 10 feet closer without making a sound. It was like it just materialized right there, 20 feet from me. I didn't give it a chance to close, and I put a rifle round through its chest. I say through because I saw no blood, no hole, just the muzzle flash and the damn thing flinch. I know I hit it 20 feet, but I fired another in it just in case. It ducking grinned. ISHT you not. Number 7mm Magnum round leaves anything standing in that range much less smirking. Its hollow eyes started at me, a big, razor-toothed smile jutted across that was easily twice as big as a man's, and then it moved. I can see the thing in my nightmares even now, so when I say even its movements were unnatural, I mean it. It shuffled, I think is the word, forward with a strange posture. Its arms almost doubled the length of a man, though he stood as tall, and its legs, being canine-like in nature, moved almost awkwardly while walking on its feet and knuckles. I dropped my rifle and reached for my sidearm, but it was within arm's reach before I could blink. I fell and felt piss soak my pants. I knew it, this was it, man. I was going to be doing a backwoods art project on this demonic thing. That is when I heard the shotgun from behind me to the right, from the trail I marked. My father, my uncle, and a close family friend had been near, wondering where I was and hearing the shots. They opened fire on this thing with 2 hunting rifles and a shotgun at point-blank range, and it didn't show a single wound. It just turned to face them and then back to me, smiling. After that, it bolted away and vanished into the woods. My dad helped me up and looked at me dead in the eyes, saying something, but my mind couldn't process it. There was no going back to camp that night. I was in the pickup and on my way home within 2 hours. When we made it back to town, I was finally recovering from the shock. My dad and uncle sat me down to talk once we got home and I got cleaned up. These men were veterans and special forces, yet still, they looked so pale. My dad gave me a cup of coffee and said that none of the rest of the people I know on this earth need to know that he was there. He knew the game ward, and they would take care of things. As for what I saw, he only had this to say: your great-grandpa knew the Indians that lived in these parts, and they used to warn us of evil spirits. Your grandpa won't hunt anymore because of something he saw as a young man. I have seen men die firsthand, and yet something I saw near when I was lost, a boy, still wakes me up at night. All of us have seen things we can't explain. I got lucky and didn't lose my son tonight, so you take as long as you need to talk about it, alright? The next day, 30 armed men, including a preacher, scoured those woods as my dad picked up our gear and told them where he had last seen the thing. Officials bought and closed off the land without saying a word to anyone as to why. It all disappeared, and after a few months of therapy, I was doing well. I only wonder what could have happened and when I'll stop dreaming of whatever it was. A popular internet phenomenon is dubbed the closest thing I've ever seen to its description as the rake or even a Wendigo, but none of that matters. Now that I'm a father myself, neither my boys nor I go out into any woods alone because I personally know somewhere out there that thing is waiting, and I'll be damned if my son is its next victim. When I was 11 years old, I had a peculiar experience that remains vivid in my memory, even 29 years later. It was an ordinary day, just like any other. My mother, grandmother, and I had gone to the local grocery store in our small town in southwest Missouri. The trip was uneventful, as usual, but it felt like an eternity before we returned home. As we drove back, the sun had just begun to set. I could still see fairly well, but I was eager to get home. When we arrived, my mother exclaimed, "Trixie is out." Trixie was our family's large female Rottweiler. Looking in the direction she pointed, it indeed appeared like our dog was outside. However, my mother was worried that Trixie might see us and run across the highway, potentially putting herself in danger. In a panic, I jumped on my bicycle and raced towards my grandparents' house, which was across the highway from our home. After a minute or so of cycling, I spotted a large, black creature. It was not a dog, nor was it a bear. I had no idea what it could be. As I approached the creature, I locked up the brakes on my bike, causing it to skid sideways and crash to the ground. The creature then turned and looked straight at me. I froze in fear as the creature frantically ran and jumped over a barbed wire fence, disappearing into the woods. I quickly regained my composure, mounted my bike, and raced back to where my mother and grandmother were unloading groceries. I told them about what I had seen, but they were just as puzzled as I was. Trixie was in the yard, so they knew it wasn't our dog. The sighting of the unknown creature sent shivers down my spine, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of the creature's eyes glaring at me was seared into my memory, and it haunted me for many sleepless nights. Despite my terror, I continued to explore the very same woods where I had seen the creature. I never encountered anything else like it again, but stories in the area persisted of a black panther or a family of large black cats. However, I had never seen any evidence of such creatures, and I was pretty sure that I would have recognized a panther if I had seen one. As I grew older, I continued to venture into the wilderness to hunt and fish in Missouri, but I never encountered any such animal again. This experience, though terrifying, taught me that the world is full of creatures that we don't understand, and it made me appreciate the mysteries of the natural world even more. I grew up in rural Missouri. My family moved there in 1985, when I was 4. About 15 to 20 minutes from the closest town, with the closest town being Wright City, Missouri, about 15 minutes north. It really was in the middle of nowhere. You had to drive a mile or two down one gravel road before you got to the gravel road I lived down, which was about a mile and a half long and that only my family and our neighbor lived on. There were about 3,000 to 4,000 acres north of us that no one lived on and about 1,000 acres south of us that no one lived on. They were all owned by the same guy who only came out during deer season to hunt the property south of us and lived in a town about 20 miles west. The land north of us was mostly an incredibly hilly forest with a few caves about a mile north of a house. I had a few sightings while growing up there. I had always told myself it was Momo, the Missouri monster, Moe's version of Bigfoot. It wasn't until I saw a trail cam photo of what was said to be a forest ghoul several years later. This led me to do a little more research, which I'll mention later. My first memorable sighting was when I was a teenager. Me, my brother, sister, and dad were playing a game I learned in Boy Scouts called Manhunt that was basically a blend of hide and seek and tag. We'd set a boundary around a cedar thicket just north of the house. Me and my little brother were on a team against my dad and sister. Me and my brother hid first, with my dad and sister eventually catching us. We then let my dad and sister hide and went to go find them. We ended up catching my sister, but we couldn't find my dad, so we started working together. The trees were thick and the sun was setting. We were probably in the last 10 minutes of daylight for the day. We want to catch our dad fast before we can't see anymore. We searched most of the area and didn't find him. Eventually, I spotted what looked like 2 feet, about 20 to 30 feet, in front of us. They were barefoot and pale, not thinking much of it. I told my brother I thought Dad had taken his shoes off to be more stealthy. We spread out about 20 feet apart and tried to sneak up on him from opposite sides. We crouched the whole way so we could see under the cedar trees because we couldn't see through the thicket. We got about 15 feet away before it realized we were coming up on it, and it took off. We both took off running after it, thinking it was my dad. We chased it to the edge of the thicket, where there was a small open glade before the start of the large forest that spread back into the hills. We yelled that he was running out of bounds, and as we got to the edge of the thicket, we noticed what appeared to be a pale, naked man jetting into the woods. This spooked the hell out of my brother and me, but we still wanted to believe it was just my dad playing with us. So we ran in the opposite direction back south towards the house, only to see my dad sitting next to my sister by a pond easily 100 yards across the field from the thicket. We asked my dad how he got over there so fast, and he and my sister told us he'd been sitting there with her for 20 minutes, waiting for us to figure out he wasn't in the woods. My brother and I tried to explain what we saw to him, but he blew it off, saying it was probably just a deer. Meanwhile, we had chickens multiple times as I was growing up. Normally, they'd be fine in the chicken coop for a few months, then something would start killing them. Tearing open the wire fencing to the caged yard, usually we'd find 1 or 2 chickens just torn up and laying in the yard. My mom and dad always said it was wild dogs, but the chickens never looked eaten, just slaughtered. He'd always repaired the fencing, yet it kept happening. Usually, once it started, most of our chickens would be dead and gone within a week or 2. My mom would be upset since she's the one who wanted to have chickens and would normally give up on them until the next spring, when she'd get a couple dozen more. Sometimes she'd skip a year, but I can think of at least 4 to 5 occasions of getting batches of chickens and them all dying. Eventually, she gave up and took a few years off from trying to raise chickens. In my senior year of high school, she decided to try having chickens again. It was good at first, but a couple months later, they started getting killed again. This time, though, it was peeling off the wire roof of the caged yard. Cage was about 5 to 6 feet tall. My dad said it was dogs, but the opening would normally be a few feet off the ground. I remember questioning my dad at that point, saying if it were dogs, wouldn't they be trying to dig under the fence, not go in from the top? The slaughtering seemed to be worse than before, with dead chickens being tossed all over the yard, yet just torn up and not eaten. My sister had gotten a pygmy goat the year before to raise for FFA. One day, we found it dead and mutilated as well. It was in a stable yard on the side of our barn with a 6 to 7 foot fence around it, yet something had still gotten to it. Parents still claimed it was dogs. Then one night my sister's boyfriend was having a bonfire party, and I went over there with my sister because my parents wouldn't let her go to a party without me going with her to watch over her. My sister got really drunk, but I didn't drink much because I was too busy watching over her. I think I had maybe half a beer all night. We left late that night, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. When I got home, I would park my truck in the yard next to the driveway, usually facing the chicken coop. I pulled in, and my sister just started screaming and pointing forward. I looked up and saw what, at the time, I could best describe as something that looked like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings on the roof of the chicken coop. It was staring right at us, crouched down, just like Gollum normally is in the movies. It was pale white, and it had very thin hair on top of its head, probably less than Gollum had in the movies. And it had 2 red eyes that glowed in the headlights. It appeared to be hissing at us. I locked the doors and quieted my sister down, then started honking the horn and flashing between my brights and regular headlights. Me and my sister were both freaking out. It jumped off the back of the chicken coop in the direction of the woods north of the house, and I lost sight of it. My parents had turned on the outside lights at that point and were looking out the door. I grabbed my sister and ran as fast as I could inside with her. When we tried to tell my parents what we saw, they refused to believe us. They told us we were just drunk and full of shit. I tried to tell them I wasn't drunk, but they wouldn't believe me. Sadly, my sister was so drunk that she didn't even remember coming home the next day. A few nights later, we were all gathering up in the living room to watch a movie we had rented from the video store. As we were watching the previews, we heard the chickens screeching. My dad was still convinced it was dogs and had a loaded 30-30 rifle by the back door ready for when they showed up again. He ran, grabbed his rifle and a spotlight also near the door, and ran out back. A few moments after he went outside, we heard a gunshot followed by continuous firing until he emptied the whole clip. This was very unlike him. Growing up, he taught me and my brother that a good hunter only takes 1 shot at something. If you need 2 or more, you are not getting a good enough shot. He even made us get our first kill with single-load muzzle-loaded black powder rifles before we could use a regular rifle with a magazine. Never in my entire life had I seen or heard my dad unload a full clip at something. He charged back in and immediately told us kids to go lock all the doors and windows to the house. He was white as a ghost. Meanwhile, he said he needed to talk to my mom. He took my mom into the back room and closed the door, where they were for 20 minutes. I already knew what it was. I was already scared before he even went outside. Me and my brother and sister waited in the living room until they got done talking. I asked him what he saw, and he told me he didn't want to talk about it and not bring it up again. The next day, he and my mom decided to slaughter all the chickens and that we wouldn't be getting more. To this day, my dad still won't talk about what he saw, and nowadays he acts like it never happened and plays stupid. I went off to college a couple months later, and I never saw it again after that. I'd sometimes tell people they're my Momo story, but I never really thought much more about it.